You lose sense of time, you lose sense of space, you lose sense of just everything, really. I mean, it's four walls and nothing else. And all you do the whole day is nothing. Speak to no one, go nowhere. And this is day after day after day.
Hello, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Shipley, opinions editor here at the Post. And I'm joined by someone we haven't seen in a very, very long time, but who we are very happy to see today, Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir, a very warm welcome to Washington Post Live.
Hello, David. Thank you so much for having me, and it's wonderful to be back on the Washington Post platform, and I really mean this in many ways.
Well, but before we get into other things, maybe tell us a little bit about the last 2 weeks. What have you noticed?
Well, frankly, the last 2 weeks have been completely surreal. You know, it's as if I'm watching some sort of a film from a side. It's a very good film, but it doesn't feel like this is happening in real life. Just a few weeks ago, I was absolutely certain that I would die in Putin's gulag. And you know, now I'm sitting at home and speaking with you, and I'm here with my family, and I could hug my kids, hug my wife, whom I wasn't allowed even to call on the phone from prison. And so this is Vladimir Bukovsky, who's a prominent Soviet-era dissident and longtime prisoner of conscience, who was himself exchanged in 1976 in actually what was the first of its kind East-West exchange involving political prisoners. There'd been exchanges involving spies on both sides before, but this was the first exchange of political prisoners in December 1976. It was an exchange mediated by the US administration at the time, the Ford administration. It involved Bukovsky on the Soviet side and Luis Corvalán, the Chilean Communist Party leader who was imprisoned in Chile under General Pinochet on the other side. And in his book, recalling this historic exchange, Bukovsky compared the experience to what a deep-sea diver feels when he suddenly bursts out from the depths of the ocean onto the surface, and you just completely lose your orientation. You just have absolutely no idea what's happening, and you need time to sort of acclimate, to get back, to transition back into reality. This is the metaphor he used, and I think it's a very appropriate one, spot on. I mean, this is exactly how I've been feeling, and I don't know how much time it will take to acclimate, to get back into some sort of normal, and to realize that this is actually happening in reality instead of being some sort of a dream. But all I can say is that there are no words adequate enough to express how grateful I feel, and I think I can speak for all of us who are on that plane bound for Ankara from Moscow earlier this month, how grateful I feel to all friends in the free world who throughout all this time, throughout all this hell, never stopped advocating, never stopped speaking out, never forgot for a second about those political prisoners who are sitting in Putin's gulag, having committed no crime except, speaking out against Putin's dictatorship, except speaking out against Putin's aggressive and criminal war against Ukraine. And had it not been for this tireless campaigning by people of goodwill in so many countries, including here in the United States, including my friends at the Washington Post, to whom I'm eternally grateful, this would not be happening. I would not be speaking to you now. And I also think it is very important to say and to remember that while the 16 of us on that plane 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, was snatched out of the Putin's gulag, there are so many others who are still there. There are thousands of people. There are Russian political prisoners. There are Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian hostages. There are hundreds and hundreds, more than 1,000 political prisoners in neighboring Belarus, right? There are two dictatorships still left in Europe, Russia under Putin and Belarus under Lukashenko. And we must not forget about them for a moment, and we must not relent until they are free and out of this hell as well. And this is one of the issues that I'm going to be dedicating a lot of time and effort to, now that I'm out of it myself and back to life, back to reality.
There is, I hope we can talk more about that later in the conversation. There is the moment that you came up for air was captured on a clip that I'm sure you've encountered. And we wanted to show that to the audience just quickly. Can you guys roll it?
Алло, алло.
Алло? Алло, пап?
Да, Катюшечка, это ты?
Да, пап, привет.
Привет, маленький.
Привет, хорошо тебя слышать.
Вы там где?
We're in the Oval Office.
No, no word is strong enough for this. I was sure I'm going to die in prison. I don't believe what's happening. I still think I'm sleeping in my prison cell in Omsk instead of hearing your voice. But I just want you to know that you've done a wonderful thing by saving so many people. I think there were 16 of us on the plane. Again, I still can't believe it's happening.
I mean, amazing pivot to English in those circumstances.
I've used the word of it for the previous 2.5 years, so I'm surprised I can actually still use it.
It was stunning. How is your family? How are they faring?
They're fine. They've held out for this 2.5 years of hell, amazingly strongly. And it has always been the case, and it is the case now, that it's actually much harder on the families of political prisoners than it is on political prisoners themselves, because after all, we did this all purposefully. I mean, I've been in Russian politics for almost 25 years, all this time in opposition to Vladimir Putin's regime, to Vladimir Putin's dictatorship. I mean, I knew what I was getting into. This is my life. This is my mission. And on a lot of us, people like my colleague Ilya Yashin, for example, can say the same thing. But our families are suffering only because they are our families, because they're our wives, because they are our children. And this is a very old, very well, unfortunate is not a strong enough word for this, but it's a very old tradition going back to Soviet times, when the regime in the Kremlin would fight not only their political opponents but also their families. In sort of the worst, the most horrendous times under Stalin, the wives and children of so-called enemies of the people were actually arrested and sent into the Gulag or internal exile themselves. In sort of less gruesome times, and under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, they were just pressured, certainly not allowed to speak or communicate with their loved ones, and this is what we're seeing again today. And so it is much harder on our families and on our loved ones than it was on us. And so I'm so deeply grateful to my family, especially to my wife Yevgenia, who, as well as caring about our 3 children, caring about our home, basically carrying on and trying to make life as normal as possible for our kids. She also took on all of my work, all of my campaigning, all of my civil advocacy and political missions, and she's done it amazingly. She's done it, frankly, much better than I ever did. And so there are no words adequate enough to express how grateful I feel to my family for enduring these 2.5 years of hell. And we will all need adjusting. It's not just for me; it is for them as well. And so it's only been it's been less than 2 weeks, and I think we will need much more time to sort of get used to each other again, get back to normal, get back to reality, get back into life. But as I said, it feels like a dream, it feels like a film, but it's an amazing one, and it is a miracle. I don't think there's any other way of putting it.
As you might imagine, we've been flooded by questions from the audience and people who have followed your writing in the Post. We have one from Jacqueline Ritz of New Mexico, who asks, what major or constant thought focus kept your spirit elevated throughout your ideal? I imagine your family and some of the issues that you've just spoken about have, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our viewer for this question. So it's a very important one. I would name 3 things that sort of kept me going in those conditions in which it's very difficult for any human being to sort of keep going. And I'm certainly no Superman. I'm just a regular human being as anybody else. And in order to sort of maintain yourself, maintain your personality, and frankly speaking, maintain your sanity, it is important to have that focus that she's asking about. And I would name three things that kept me going throughout all this and that helped me survive. The first is my Christian faith, because I know that whatever numbers and whatever words are written by some people on pieces of paper, you know, life is not gonna go according to those pieces of paper. It's gonna go according to a higher power, a much higher power. And this is an important knowledge. This is an important focus that keeps things in perspective, as it were. And you know what happened to us on the 1st of August, I think certainly confirms that in a very clear way. The second thing I would name is my background as a historian. I'm a historian by education, and my sort of major area of study has been the modern history of Russia, the 19th and 20th century, including the Soviet period. And all of these things, everything that we are living through in Russia today, the repressive dictatorship that engages, you know, in the crackdown on the rights and freedoms of our own people, but also that engages in aggression towards neighbors and towards others. This sort of very dark, very dark period in Russian history that we're living through now under Putin. We've had all this before. We've seen all this before, both under the Tsars and under the Soviets, and we know how these things end, because you know history, frankly, is a science as much as chemistry or physics. Is just our science doesn't work on numbers and figures, but it certainly has its own laws. It certainly has its own logic, and nobody, not Vladimir Putin or anybody else, can ever override or cancel or trying to bypass the logic of history. And so we know how this will end. We know how this will end. It's only a question of time. So that's the thing number two that I would name. And then the third thing I would say, many years ago, almost 20 years ago, I made a documentary about the Soviet dissident movement. I've studied it for a long time. These are the people I admire. These are my heroes. To me, these are the real heroes of the 20th century in Russia and the Soviet Union, the people who stood up for the dignity and the reputation of our country at the worst time, at a horrible time, at a time of repression and aggression. Again, a similar time to what we're living today. This documentary is called They Chose Freedom. It was a 4-part documentary. And one of the people I interviewed for that documentary was Vladimir Bukovsky, whom I already mentioned, the dissident and longtime prisoner of conscience who was exchanged in 1976. And I asked him sort of a very similar question. I asked, what kept you going in the Gulag, in the prisons, in the labor camps? What kept you going? What helped you survive? And he answered with a very short phrase. He said, I knew that I was right. I knew that I was right. And, you know, at the time, to be honest, I thought these are just nice sounding words. And of course, I took them into the film because it sounds good. But I have to say now that, you know, having gone through a similar experience myself, I can tell you that this knowledge is really important, because I knew that I was right. I knew that the real criminals are those who are waging this aggressive and criminal war against Ukraine, not those of us who have publicly spoken out against it. Yeah. And when you know that you're right, the fear and the doubt, frankly, just disappear.
Can you describe a day in prison? How did the guards treat you? Did you talk with them? Did you have an opportunity to speak with other prisoners? What was your day? What was your night?
Well, it's very easy for me to describe, as you put it, a day in prison, because they were all the same. It's basically just a long Groundhog Day. You know, endless, meaningless, and exactly the same each one. Omsk, where I was imprisoned, it's a city in Western Siberia that has literally centuries-long traditions of holding political prisoners in Russia, both in the imperial times and the Soviet times. I mean, among the people who were there were Dostoevsky, for example, of the Decembrists back in the 19th century. In the 20th century, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was in prison in Omsk on his way to the Gulag in Kazakhstan. Mustafa Dzhemilev, the leader of the Crimean Tatars, was there as well. So it's sort of a place that holds this long, unfortunate tradition. And today, in Russia of Vladimir Putin, Omsk is known for the harshest prison regime out of the whole of our country, frankly. And when I was still on the way from my Moscow prison to Siberia in this prison train, this Stolypin prison train cars, as we call them, and when the convoy officer read out the names of the prisoners from his folder and the final destination, when he called my name and said Omsk, everybody who was around me suddenly went quiet and began to look at me with a very sorry look on their faces. And I didn't at the time, I didn't realize what the reason was, but I very well understand it now. It is the harshest prison regime in the whole of Russia. Everything is by the second, by the minute, by the rule. No step left, no step right. The whole day is, literally scheduled by the minute. 5 o'clock in the morning, 5 a.m. is the official wake-up call. You attach your bunk to the wall where it stays until 9 p.m. When it's lights out. So you cannot lie down or sit properly during the day. Just basically walk in the small cell as much as you can, or you sit at this very small and uncomfortable stool that basically just sticks out of the wall, and a tiny desk. It was a small cell, and I have to say as well that in the more than 2 years that I've been in prison, I've been in 13 different penitentiary institutions. The last one being the notorious KGB/FSB prison in Moscow, Lefortovo, from where we were taken to the exchange. So quite an appropriate number as well, Lefortovo being number 13. But what I describe now are the prisons that I was held in Omsk, because there were several too, but basically the regime and the schedules were all the same. So 5 o'clock in the morning is a wake-up call. The bunk gets attached to the wall. And then you just spend the entire day sitting in a cell. It's a small cell, 2 by 3 meters, so 7 by 10 feet, something like that.
You were given an hour to write, weren't you? Did you get 1 hour to?
An hour and a half,
your
90
thoughts
minutes. 90
so
minutes.
How would you organize your thoughts around that? I mean, that must have been. And
to somebody whose profession is writing, as it is in my case, I have to say that's a particularly sadistic rule. So essentially, what you do the whole day is you just sit and stare at a wall, because it's a small cell, 2 by 3 meters, one small window near the ceiling with metal bars, 2 metal doors, into the cell itself that only get open when you let out to the so-called walk, which is, depending if you're in punishment cell, it's 1 hour a day. If you're in a regular isolation cell, it's 1.5 hours a day. And the walk, frankly, is just, walking around in a circle in a small internal covered prison courtyard, which is not much bigger than the cell itself, but you can see a little bit of the sky upstairs through the metal bars on top. The rest of the day, you just sit in your cell, essentially doing nothing. Not able to speak to anyone, not able to go anywhere, not able to do anything. You're only given pen and paper to write for 90 minutes a day, 1.5 hours, in which you have to cram absolutely everything you have to do. So this includes, for example, preparing for court sessions, which I had quite a few, reading letters from friends and family, responding to those letters, answering any questions, from journalists, I don't know, making notes, doing any writing you have to do. You have to cramp it into those 90 minutes a day. Then the guards take the pen and paper away as well. And apart from the sort of the confined space in which you stay all the time, apart from the total solitude, because I was in solitary confinement, and it was actually it's really amusing to me. Well, amusing is probably not the appropriate word, but you have to keep your irony in prison, otherwise, otherwise it's very difficult to survive. I think Varlam Shalamov, one of the most prominent writers and the people who chronicle the Soviet Gulag, he wrote that for a prisoner to remain a human being, he or she must keep the irony, and so you have to sort of keep this ironic attitude to everything. And it was really amusing to me when my lawyer said to me that according to international law, according to the United Nations standard minimum rules on the treatment of prisoners, solitary confinement for more than 15 days in a row is officially considered to be a form of torture, degrading, and inhumane treatment. I was in solitary for almost 11 months straight without any break. And I have to say, it's really not easy when you're just completely deprived of any human contact, because as Aristotle said, human beings are social animals, right? We need communication as much as we need oxygen to breathe or water to drink or food to eat. And when you're just totally deprived of it, it is very, very difficult. And so one of the advice that people who've been through this experience always give, and I've read a lot of books, a lot of memoirs by Soviet dissidents of the past in my life. And so I was fortunate to sort of, having known about this advice as well, the advice they always give is you have to fill your time with something meaningful, something constructive, something useful. So you just don't just sit there and stare at a wall, because, well, to speak frankly, it's really easy to start going crazy pretty soon if that happens. And so I try to read as much as I can, although it's not very easy because your concentration really goes down when you're in those conditions. But I try to read as much as I can. I read up actually a lot of literature on the history of the Russian Civil War, because, as you know, Omsk was actually the capital of White Russia, of the anti-Bolshevik Russia during the Civil War in 1918, 1919. This was where the Kolchak government was based. And so there was actually, in our prison libraries there was a lot of rare materials, rare books published on the history of the Russian Civil War that I hadn't even seen in Moscow. So I took advantage of that and I read as many as I could. And I also learned Spanish, because, again, you have to do something. You have to do something with your time. You have to fill your head with something useful. And so this is how your day goes. And as I mentioned, it's all scheduled by the minute. When they give you the meals, when they take you out to walks, and then for the lights out in the evening. And one other sort of consequence of this regime that I was held in, essentially sitting as the Iron Mask from the famous novel, is that you're also completely deprived of any telephone contact with your family. In the 2 years and 3 months that I've been imprisoned, I only once was able to speak with my wife on the phone, and only twice to my 3 children. And so this is going back to what we already discussed. This is an old, very Soviet habit of the Kremlin, when they try to punish not just political opponents themselves, but their families as well.
So I guess this gets to the foundational or the existential question, which is why? Why put a human in solitary confinement in a Siberian prison a world away? Why?
Why do they do it?
Yeah. Why were you there?
Well, because the enemy must be punished, right? And I got a very clear message during my so-called trial. And in fact, my wife wrote to me. We communicated through letters. That was the only way we could keep in touch. And she wrote to me after I got my 25-year sentence back in April of 2023. This was the highest sentence for political prisoners since Stalin's time, since late 40s, early 50s. Nothing even close happened since then. And so she wrote to me that, I always had this tendency before to sort of, basically, I always doubted if I was able to, achieve anything of effect, anything of value. I would always sort of err on the side of underestimating everything that we could do and could accomplish. And Evgenia, my wife, wrote to me that, I think your self-esteem should go up a little bit after this 25-year sentence. Frankly, it's like a medal. And all jokes aside, the sentence that I received, and the sentence that Alexei Navalny received, and the sentence that Ilya Yashin received, and many other colleagues of mine, these sentences have shown what the Putin regime is really afraid of. In my case, it wasn't just public opposition to the war in Ukraine. It wasn't just public advocacy on behalf of political prisoners. It wasn't just sort of public speeches in international platforms talking about the illegitimacy, the illegality of Vladimir Putin bypassing the constitutional term limits, for example, and staying in power indefinitely. This was all in my sentence too, so we know that these things have really irritated them. But sort of the unspoken and unwritten charge that I was convicted for was also my involvement in the passage of Magnitsky laws, the passage of Magnitsky Acts in several Western countries, beginning here in the United States. These were the laws that imposed targeted sanctions, visa and financial sanctions, on key officials of the Kremlin, on key officials of the Putin regime. And frankly, there are a few things that they feared more than losing their coveted access to Western countries, to Western institutions, to Western financial systems. And so just to drive home the point, the judge that gave me my 25-year sentence was the same judge who imprisoned Sergei Magnitsky back in 2008. He was one of the first people sanctioned by the United States government under the Magnitsky Act. So if there was, there couldn't have been a clearer message that the Kremlin could send in this. And so then, of course, the enemy has to be punished. And so this is why Siberia, this is why solitary confinement, this is why these conditions that can only be described as tortures according to international law. Torture can be not only of the physical kind. I think a lot of people, when they think about torture, they only imagine the physical things, when they break your back, when you give you electric shock and all the rest of it. And by the way, these things happen. These things are rampant in Putin's prison system. But for the sort of more high-profile political prisoners, they use a different kind of torture. They use the psychological and mental torture. And I can tell you that it's not, it's no better than the physical kind. In fact, it could be much more difficult.
I mean, do you think the release of Russian political prisoners will help the anti-Putin opposition inside Russia and without?
Well, first of all, I think what happened with us gives a lot of hope to so many others who are still languishing in Putin's gulag, because one other measure of, I guess you can describe it as a sort of a way of applying mental pressure on prisoners. Every day, whenever I wrote anything, like any official paper you write to the prison director, for example, anytime you're told to present yourself, like say your name, say your cell number, and all the rest of it, you also have to state the date of your release. So the length of your prison sentence. In my case, that's a date that's going to stay in my memory forever. April the 21st, 2047. This was when I was, scheduled to get out. Of course, that date was purely theoretical, because I would never have survived that. Because, after 2 FSB organized poisonings, I don't exactly have the state of health to. I mean, even for the most healthy person in the world, the Russian gulag is not exactly a good place to be, let alone for people like Alexei Navalny or myself who have survived what we did. And so I had to sort of pronounce this date every day, and so do all the political prisoners who remain in Putin's gulag now. And I'm thinking in particular of people like Alexei Gorinov, a Moscow municipal councillor, who was the first person to be arrested and criminally charged for public opposition to the war in Ukraine. I'm thinking of Maria Ponomarenko, a journalist from Siberia, mother of 2 daughters, who's also in prison for her public opposition to the war. I'm thinking of Igor Baryshnikov, an engineer from Kaliningrad, who's been in prison for his anti-war stance, and so many others. And these people, every day, they have to sort of, publicly name this release date. And all I have to say, frankly, it really gets on you when you do this day after day after day. And when all you do is you wake up in the same cell, not doing anything, not speaking to anyone, not going anywhere, not being able to even call your loved ones, it really gets on you. And so I think what happened on the 1st of August with this release gives hope to a lot of people back in Russia, back in Putin's gulag, that these dates, that this release date that they have to pronounce, that it's not actually connected to reality, and that if enough people of goodwill in the free world decide that they're not okay with this, they're not okay with so many innocent people being confined to prisons, being away from their loved ones, only because they're opposed to Putin's aggressive war, only because they're opposed to Putin's dictatorship, that this public opinion can actually work, and that there is a way that these people will be free much, much sooner than their official prison papers say. And as I've said, I'm going to dedicate my time, and I'm going to dedicate all the strength that I have left to advocating, to campaigning for all of those Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians who are still stuck back in those gulags, in those prisons. And I'm not going to rest until the day they are free.
And Vladimir, so how do you break through? I mean, I remember listening to your CNN interview as you are led through the Omsk airport, and you're there in your black long johns and a t-shirt and your shower sandals and
No, in Omsk, I was still in my prison clothes. This
those
I had to change in the shower sandals in Moscow, right?
and handcuffs, and you're going through a commercial air terminal with
Right.
people who are going about their lives. You look at the most recent polling around the war in Ukraine, and there's a lot of Russians who evince remarkably little interest in it, at least according to the polls. So people are going about their lives. They are living their lives with a war that is going on that they're either less aware of than they might be, or really have made a decision about. How do you begin to continue? How do you make that case, especially since you aren't in Russia? I mean, you've talked often about going back as a Russian politician. You know, that's something that you did at enormous cost. That's something that Alexei Navalny did at tremendous cost. How do you carry on that conversation with the Russian people? Because inevitably, that's where it has to come from, right?
Absolutely. But David, before we talk any more about this, let's please never use the word polls when we talk about an authoritarian regime. It is completely meaningless. I mean, when people talk about polls or elections in Putin's Russia, I don't know if they're joking or if they're just being provocative, because dictatorships don't do polls. Dictatorships don't do elections. These are all sort of notions from a democratic society. First of all, when people actually have access to information, as opposed to just being brainwashed by government propaganda. But secondly, when people are not afraid to speak their mind, and when people don't think that if they answer in a quote unquote incorrect way, there'll be consequences for themselves and for their families. So let's just forget about, you know, polls and elections and everything that you used to hear in the US, that these notions do not apply to authoritarian countries. In fact, Boris Nemtsov, my close friend, my mentor, the Russian opposition leader who was murdered on Putin's orders in February of 2015, he always said that in the conditions of an authoritarian state like Russia under Putin, where there are no free elections, where there are no meaningful and reliable opinion polls, the best way to test the real state of public opinion is to actually see at what sort of views, what sort of positions the regime persecutes more. And it is enough to look at the scale of repression in the last 2.5 years in Russia against people who are coming out publicly against the war in Ukraine, to see that, you know, what these so-called polls say is actually really removed from reality. I mean, there have been tens of thousands of police detentions across Russia for anti-war demonstrations since February 2022 until today. There are hundreds of people who are imprisoned today in Putin's Gulag because they have publicly spoken out against the war in Ukraine. I've seen many of these people on my prison transfer from Moscow to Siberia. I've seen them when I was still in my pre-trial detention center in the prison in Moscow, where I could still actually communicate with people. It is very a large quantity of people, and that's only a drop in the ocean. That's only the tip of the iceberg. And so let's not forget about that when we speak about public opinion. But you are absolutely right that, of course, there are a lot of people in Russia who are either indifferent or who back what the Putin regime is doing in Ukraine. It is tragic. It is something that I don't even know what right word to use here to describe my emotion. It's something that makes me very angry, very sad at the same time, needless to say. But it is also something that, frankly, should not be surprising after a quarter century of one-man dictatorship. Vladimir Putin's been in power for 25 years. Let's not forget that. One of the first things he did after coming to power was shut down or take over independent television networks to make sure that Russian society only receives officially approved messages, officially approved propaganda. And so after 25 years of propaganda, after 25 years of brainwashing, after 25 years of repression, when those people who are publicly coming out against the regime and its policies are murdered, are imprisoned, are, in the best case, exiled. I think it's hard to expect, frankly, that a large part of society would not be affected by this, and it is. And by the way, when we speak about the fact that a large part of Russian society bears responsibility for what Putin is doing in Ukraine today and for what Putin is doing generally, that is absolutely true. But let's not forget also that a lot of this responsibility is also borne by leaders of Western countries who, for so many years, despite our cries, shouts, warnings, I don't know how else to express it, continued to engage with Vladimir Putin, to legitimize Vladimir Putin in the eyes of the international community, to trade with him, to make deals with him, to invite him to international summits, to look into his eyes and see his soul, to engage in resets, and so on and so forth. This is a fact as well. And let's not forget about the responsibility that Western leaders bear for what is happening in Russia and for what is happening in Ukraine today. But it is absolutely clear to my mind that once this regime is out of power, and it is only a question of when and not if. Again, this is me speaking as a historian, not as a politician. It is only a question of when, not if. When this regime is out of power, there will have to be enormous work undergone in Russia to try to deal with the consequences of this. I mean, we wouldn't be the first one who have to do this. There are a lot of countries in the world who have gone through this trauma of dictatorship, who have gone through this difficult process of transitioning from dictatorships to democracy. Very different countries in very different geographical regions in very difficult historical circumstances. And look, Argentina after military dictatorship, South Africa after apartheid, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe after communism, of course, Germany after Nazism after 1945. So this is a road that has been traveled many times. We will not be the first ones to do it. But to me, one of the most important things we'll have to work on, I already mentioned the advocacy for political prisoners. That is absolutely paramount, but no less important is working on this roadmap, if you will, on how we can heal and transition and, yes, educate Russian society post-Putin about everything that happened. There will have to be acknowledgement, there will have to be public reflection, there will have to be public responsibility. That's something that never happened really after 1991 in Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet regime, and this is what brought us to Putin. I've spoken and written about it many times, including on the pages of the Washington Post. We will have to do this work. And so this is a roadmap that we need to be preparing today, because if we go by Russian history, major political changes in our country usually happen like this, unexpectedly and suddenly. And the next time will be absolutely the same. I mean, just think of the fact that both the Roman Empire at the beginning of the 20th century and the Soviet regime at the end of the 20th century collapsed in 3 days. This is not a figure of speech. I'm talking literally here. And this is how it's going to happen next time. And so we all need to be preparing for our part how we deal with this inside of Russia. But also I think it is very important it's very important for the free world, for the leaders of Western democracies, to prepare on their side as well. Because once things really do change in Russia, and once, we do start this work on transitional justice, on this transition from dictatorship to democracy inside of Russia, it is very important that the free world stands ready to help reintegrate that new democratic post-Putin Russia back into the civilized world, back into the rule-based international order, back into the big Europe that we all want to see. If we still believe in that goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, a goal was expressed, famously 35 years ago by an American president speaking in West Germany, as you remember. If we still believe in the goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, that goal will only be possible when Russia, which is the largest country in Europe, also becomes peaceful and democratic. A Europe whole, free, and in peace will only be possible with a peaceful and democratic Russia as a part of it. And this is a roadmap that we need to start preparing today.
We have, alas, gone ridiculously over time. I am told. But it has been worth every second, and I wish we could go on.
I'm sorry, Dave. I really
I
enjoy
wish we
speaking
could
to
go
people
on
after
for
spending
another.
time in solitary confinement. So forgive me for this.
I guess maybe this conversation will have to be carried on in the pages of the Washington Post, where there are pages and pages waiting to be filled with your words, Vladimir.
I'd be very happy to, and I'm always honored by the opportunity. And I'm glad I could carry on from prison as well. I don't know how many columnists you had writing from behind bars, but I was honored by the opportunity that you allowed me to continue this.
There also weren't that many who were awarded Pulitzer Prizes for commentary for their work both inside and outside of prison. How did word of the Pulitzer get to you? Did it get to you?
Well, speaking about surreal, it did get to me. It was on one of the visits by my lawyer, who usually came to see me once or twice a week. So I'd be escorted by the prison guards into the small, tiny Roman loft behind a glass window, and then my lawyer would come in from the outside and sit on the other side, and so we would sort of speak about, things in preparation for our court hearings and so on. And one day in May, he walks in and says that I've been awarded a Pulitzer Prize, and I have to say, nothing. This was before the exchange, right? But by that time, nothing had ever felt more surreal. I was, of course, deeply honored and deeply humbled by this recognition, but it also felt like something out of another planet, frankly, when I was sitting in that solitary cell in Siberia. And, I'd never imagined the words Pulitzer and my name in the same sentence. So I cannot express enough how grateful and humbled I am for this recognition, but it's something that also felt completely unreal, and as if I were watching some kind of a film as well. I mean, I've been watching a lot of films this year. They've been really good ones, and I just hope that, sometime soon, the film and the reality actually sink in together.
Well, it's really nice, at least temporarily, to end on a happy ending. Vladimir, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on Washington Post Live. And thanks to all of you for joining us for more conversations like this one, though probably not like this one. Please sign up for a Washington Post subscription or get a free trial by visiting washingtonpost.com/live. I'm David Shipley, and thank you again.